Hi there, and on today's Anatomy of Speed, we're going to be looking at drift cars. And Matty Hill's 2JZ powered S15 is a perfect example of how to build a drift car in order to compete in today's events. Now, drift cars are a little bit different to circuit cars and drag cars in the way they're built for a bunch of different reasons. We've got drift cars are super low, they've got fantastic grip in the front end, they need a heap of lock. In the rear, they need not a lot of traction as you're learning to drift, but then as you get better and better, you need more and more traction in the back. We need to have panels that come off nice and easy because doesn't matter how good you are, every now and then you're going to bump into a competitor. We need a huge, awesome cooling system because to keep these tyres churning the smoke out, the whole purpose of drifting and one of the things you get judged on, the engine needs to be holding right up on the rev limiter all of the time. And sometimes when you're sliding through a corner, you don't actually have a heap of airspeed. So we need to address all those cooling problems as well. In the early days of competitive drifting, it wasn't unusual to see an SR20 or a 3S Beams 4-cylinder style engine in any of these high-level drift cars. Whereas now, things have really changed and the guys have stepped it up. So we've got big power 2JZs, we've got big power LS, we've got things like the new NASCAR style V8 engines. Matty Hill has chosen the mighty 6-cylinder 2JZ engine as his weapon of choice. As soon as the hood opens, the first thing that you see are the extensive modifications to the engine bay. All the inner guards have been chopped out, the whole front radiator support's all been removed and replaced with this tubular setup, which makes the car really, really easy to work on. In between rounds, we can pull stuff off straight away. The front bar pops off with a couple of rubber strips, all really nice and easy to service. Nice and easy, like I said, if there was a bump, you can get in, you can pull things out quickly and you can get the car running real fast. They're very, very low, there's very limited suspension travel. They've normally got huge camber on the front. And the reason for that is because they've got a huge amount of steering lock on the front. This thing's got the WiseFab front lock kit and the control arms. So if I turn the steering wheel like this, look how far the lock to lock is or how far the wheels turn. That's not for reverse parking, this thing. That's because when these guys are entering a corner, the car is so sideways that they need extra amounts of lock in order to have good control over the car. If this thing had a standard style steering setup, meaning that we would only have a very minute, say maybe 2 or 3 turns of the steering wheel until we hit the lock stop and the wheels don't turn anymore. That's fantastic for a circuit car. In some circuit cars, we actually have less lock in order to have more control. In an everyday car that you drive to the shops, if you had this amount of lock, you wouldn't have as much steering feel as you really should have for a street car. Whereas in a drift car, having so much lock, being able to turn those wheels so much means that the entries can be as sideways as possible. In the front, the car's got shockwork suspension and this interesting strut top here. So yes, it's got the factory position for the strut top, which is probably part of the ruling for some of the pro style drifting. But if you look carefully here, you'll notice that the shock position is outbound of the normal strut top. And we do that to give us more track. So the front wheels are essentially wider, giving us a more stable car to drift. Quickly, it's got GTR style front brakes, DBA discs and pads. The brakes on a car like this, while we do need them, they're not used as long as a circuit car or a regular street car. So it's a little bit unusual to see a huge amount of braking in a car like this because that introduces extra unsprung weight and we simply don't need that braking power. This thing is now a 3.1 litre 2JZ VVTi 6-cylinder engine. This is the 2JZ. Came out in the Supra, came out in all the Aristos. This is a very, very desirable engine now. They make a huge amount of power, they rev really nicely, they drive good, and they develop a huge amount of torque because of the big capacity of the engine. So they were available as a 1J that was a 2.5 litre engine, or the 2J that was the 3 litre engine. Obviously you can get stroker kits. This thing is a 3.1, but you can bring them up to sort of 3.4 litre with relative ease. And that will produce a hell of a lot more torque than, say, a 2.5 litre or a 2 litre 4-cylinder, for example. And that's the beauty of having a big 6-cylinder in a drift car, is because obviously these guys want power, but more than power, they want torque and they want snappy response, because when they're flying into a corner in top gear, which in this case is a 4-speed gearbox, so they're coming into a corner in 4th gear, sideways, blipping that throttle in order to make as much smoke and an impressive entry as they possibly can. You need that grunt behind you. You can't have a small 4-cylinder with a huge turbocharger or an aspirated engine making 400 foot-pounds. In today's professional drifting, these guys are entering serious corner speed upwards, 180, 200 kilometers an hour, with smoke pouring out the back, holding this thing at full power at 800 odd horsepower, high 25, 26, 28 pounds of boost, and making 800 to 1,000 foot-pounds of torque. Just like any street car or any drag car or circuit car, in order to make that sort of power, we need to modify the engine. And this thing has got a built 3.1 litre. The bottom end was assembled by Red Sun Motorsport here in Sydney. It has a relatively factory cylinder head, so it's obviously got upgraded valve springs, it's got some upgraded retainers, it's got some Brian Crowler 272 stage 3 camshafts up the top with the variable inlet camshaft. So this is the VVTi engine, meaning that it's got continuously variable inlet cam angle. That helps us to pick up a heap of bottom end grunt. Then we can retard off that inlet camshaft as the revs build in order to make the most top end torque that we can. In order to get the 3.1 litre capacity, this thing's got 87mm CP pistons, it's got Nitto conrods, and it's got ARP main and head studs holding that whole bottom end together. And because the thing's got all the good stuff inside it, and because we want to make that 900 horsepower, we're going to need boost pressure. And to do that, we've got the Borg-Warner turbocharger. It's a 9180. It's mated to a 6-boost exhaust manifold, and it's got the TurboSmart 50mm wastegate over there. That TurboSmart wastegate is controlled by a Haltech boost control solenoid, which is down there on the strut tower. The engine management system is then controlling that solenoid in order to bring that turbocharger on as hard as possibly and low, making the target boost pressure of, let's say, 29 PSI as early as possible, then holding that boost pressure nice and flat in order to make the most torque that we can across the whole rev range. And it wouldn't be a drift car unless the wastegate was exiting straight out the hood. So what's going on there is that we've got the exhaust that's coming out of the 6 cylinders through the exhaust manifold. Then it either goes through the turbine housing in order to build more boost pressure through the compressor, or the wastegate's open and that exhaust exits straight out the pipe here, out the bonnet, doesn't go through the back to the exhaust. So that's where you get the smoke and the fire and the flames out the hood exit wastegate. And that's how we're controlling the boost pressure, by determining whether that exhaust goes through the rear housing or bypasses the exhaust altogether and goes out the wastegate, wasting that exhaust gas. Once the wastegate decides to put that exhaust through the exhaust housing, in turn, spinning up the compressor, that pulls a whole bunch of air in through the air filter here, goes through what we call the hot pipe, so that compressed air gets hot as it gets compressed through the turbocharger. It goes through this Phoenix 100mm tube and fin intercooler, its purpose being to cool that charge down as much as possible, comes all the way through into the intake manifold. The colder the air is, the more dense it is, the more oxygen it is, so the more power we're going to make. The hotter that charge air is, the less oxygen it has, the less power it's going to make, and the more chance we're going to have for pre-ignition or detonation in the engine, so the less safe the engine's going to be. So the idea of getting the coldest air we possibly can by having a nice efficient intercooler is definitely the way to go. Once we've got that nice cold air in the inlet manifold, we need to put some fuel with it. It's got some Bosch 2200cc injectors along here. We've got the fuel pressure regulator. It's got a TurboSmart FPR 800. We'll move down the back and have a look at the fuel system, but it's pretty cool. It's got an ATL fuel tank that's got a real nice look to it, and it's got an internal surge tank inside that sort of baffled tank. So one assembly that makes it real nice. It's got two Walbro 525 fuel pumps. They're staged, meaning that when we start the car, it runs on the primary fuel pump. Then as engine load increases, it comes up to say 4,000 RPM and about 8 pounds of boost. The second pump then turns on, so we've got all of that fuel flow. So two Walbro 460 fuel pumps capable of really roughly 400, 450 kilowatts at the wheels each pump. So they're a really, really impressive thing. This car runs on full E85, so United E85 straight from the Bowser, and it's got all Teflon fuel lines, speed flow fitting, so it's got all the good gear there. In a car like this where, like I keep saying, we do tend to see them bump a little bit, bump each other, bump the wall, whatever the case, we want to make sure that we've got high quality fittings, because any fuel line coming loose or cracking or leaking is obviously a huge danger in a sport like this. When the guys have built this car, they've done an excellent job of making it look simple. And making something look simple is one of the hardest parts of building a car, in my opinion. The way that they've done that, there's a heap of stuff missing from the front here. We've got the intercooler, we've got a big engine oil cooler, which is really important for a thing like this to keep our oil temperatures down, in turn keeping the engine temperatures down, then helping keep the coolant temperatures down. There's no radiator at the front. The water pump's missing. So what we've got here is two hoses that come from the header tank and from where the water pump was supposed to be, but we've got two big dash fittings. They go all the way through. They go into some metal lines or aluminium lines that go all the way to the back of the car. And in a minute, we'll go down the back and have a look at the cooling setup, because the radiator's in the boot of the car. It's got a radiator and it's got an electric water pump back there. Again, the reason they do that in a car like this is because, first of all, if the radiator was in the front and we had a small bump or a small incident on track, there's a good chance we're going to break the radiator and then we're out for the day. If it's in the back, it's well protected, it's away from the carnage, so we'll be able to keep going if we happen to bump the front. The other thing that happens with these cars is a little bit interesting. They do have temperature problems, and that's because drifting now has become pretty high level, and these guys are entering corners, top gear, top RPM, huge entry speeds, upwards of 200 kilometers an hour. But that doesn't quite tell the whole story like a circuit car, because a circuit car at 200 kilometers an hour is always heading pretty much straight. So we know how much airflow we're getting through the engine bay, regardless of whether there's aero or not, and sometimes that's taken into consideration there. In a car like this, when they're entering at 180, 200 kilometers an hour sideways, you're not getting a huge amount of airflow through the engine bay, which does result in cooling problems. So in order to counter that, the guys put the radiators in the back of the car. They've got heaps and heaps of room there for fans. They set up the cooling in such a way that you can hold the thing sideways with relatively limited airflow, but maintain a comfortable engine temperature. So further than moving just the radiator and the water pump out of the way up here, the guys have also fitted an electric power steering system. So normally the power steering pump would be attached to the side of the engine. It would have a belt that's driven off the crankshaft, but in cars like this, where we've got sustained high RPM and that blipping, we often get problems with the mechanical power steering pumps here, where they actually boil the fluid and we start to have a whole bunch of weird power steering problems. To fix that mechanical pump overspeeding, you can change the gearing on the front of those pumps, but instead of doing that, the guys have fit an electric power steering pump. It's not affected by engine RPM, so that maintains a constant pressure at the steering rack, making the car a little bit easier to drive and a lot more consistent. Another great thing that it does, by removing the water pump and removing the power steering from the front of the engine here, we've got the drive belt that goes from the crankshaft to the alternator. It is a slightly underdriven alternator as well, meaning that the alternator pulley is larger than we normally expect, meaning that the alternator is going to spin a little bit slower, knowing that we're going to have prolonged high RPM. But in a car like this, what that means is that it free revs up, it blips, you get a lot more response out of the engine because you're not pushing that power steering and that water pump off the main engine. You're pushing it, they're all electronic now, so that makes that a whole lot nicer. And it stops having a whole bunch of belts on the front that can flick off. In this style of driving, you can end up having belt alignment problems or just weird dramas where drive belts tend to fall off a lot more often than you'd expect. And lastly, in the engine bay here, we'll talk about the ignition system. The 2JZ VVT engine, most of them came with 3 ignition coils and then 3 plug leads joining the paired cylinders. 1 and 6 shared a coil, 2 and 5 shared a coil, and 3 and 4 shared a coil. And that's what we call wasted spark. So as we're firing the spark event on cylinder 1, its opposing cylinder, cylinder 6, is getting a wasted spark. We tend to move away from that a little bit now because a lot of those systems are just getting a little bit old. The ignition modules that fire those coils are getting a little bit hard to find and they don't make enough spark energy. So what do you do to get more spark energy into a Toyota? You fit Nissan R35 coils, of course, because they're a fantastic coil. They're being used in a heap of direct fire ignition conversions now. So yes, it's the Nissan R35 coil. Lots of companies now are making brackets that you would put in, simply bolt those coils in and they're a huge spark upgrade. They've got a built-in ignition module. The wiring's really simple. As soon as you plug them in, they just work and you stop fighting ignition misfire problems. Absolutely brilliant upgrade for any engine. So being a drift car, the thing's got a huge amount of camber on the front, and the reason for that is because when we turn the wheels all the way one way, caster gets involved there. The car actually changes the dynamic of how things are working. So in order to get a huge amount of traction, we need to have a bunch of camber on it so that when we're at full lock, we end up getting the most grip we possibly can out of these beautiful Rays 18 by, I think they're 9.5 inch on the front, a 3-piece wheel. On the back, they're 18 by 11 inch. Now, when we say anatomy of a drift car, this is exactly what I'm thinking about. Since the beginning of all of the drifting stuff, it really has been grab a car, cut, modify, do whatever it takes to make that thing drift. This is no exception. And when you look at this and have a bit of an idea of what's going on here, it's pretty impressive. So the guys have needed to fit a fuel cell and a cooling system into the boot of this car. But have you noticed that it's missing half of the car? Look what's going on here. The parcel shelf normally comes across here, and this is normally the interior of the car. You've normally got the factory speakers for the stereo are about here somewhere. But what these guys have done is they've decided that, well, they didn't need any of that space anyway. So they've made a firewall here. They've shortened that window so it's got a bit of a perspex style window for the top. Then they've customised the whole rear of the car in order to get a heap of cooling and enough space for a massive fuel cell. Up the top here is the ATL fuel cell, and this is the one I was talking about before. It's a really, really nice unit. It's one piece. It's got a bladder inside, so it can be used for a whole bunch of styles of racing. It's got the pump hanger inside already, so you don't need to pull fuel out of this into a surge tank. It's got a built-in surge tank already. It's housing the 2 Walbro 525 fuel pumps. Then it's got our feeds out, it's got our returns, and it's got our wiring bulkhead just here so that we can wire those pumps independently. Having a setup like that, the most complicated part is getting those 4 wires in, so the 2 ground wires and the 2 heavy 12-volt power wires that can support up to about 25 amps per fuel pump when we're talking about a Walbro 525. Further back, here's the radiator that we were missing out of the engine bay. So it's got a huge Phoenix radiator, then it's got the shroud on the back with the 2 thermofans, and the back of the car, like the front, is cut out as well. So there's a huge amount of airflow there to cool this. And there's even more benefits here because yes, this is a massive radiator with a huge amount of volume, meaning that we'll be able to regulate the engine temperatures a whole lot better. But keeping in mind, it's got to supply that coolant all the way to the front of the engine and all the way back. That's more coolant volume, that's more cooling capacity. Further to that, because that radiator isn't sitting in front of the engine, we've now got cool air coming through that engine. So in a way, we're kind of being able to air cool the engine as well. The ultimate cooling system. For a drift car, thinking outside the square, there's a problem with heating at the front, there's a problem with bashing radiators in the front. You know, it's not that normal to just pop the radiator in the boot, but in this form of racing, it makes perfect sense. And it's a necessity now. You know, this is the right way to do it. In order to pump that coolant from the engine into the radiator to cool it and then bring it all the way back, it's got a Davies Craig electric water pump down the bottom, and that's controlled by the Haltech ECU. So what's going on there is that the engine management system has the coolant temp sensor in the engine. When we start the thing dead cold, the engine management system pulses that water pump relatively slowly, just enough to get something to start cycling through. If the electric water pump is turned off, that means that the engine would heat that coolant all the way up the front. The radiator would stay dead cold because we'd have no flow. So the idea here is that the water pump just pulses nice and slow to circulate until we come up to the operating temperature of around 85, 88 degrees Celsius. Then we start pulsing that pump harder and harder in order to essentially regulate that temperature. So we don't need to use a thermostat because we can turn the water pump up and down in order to target our coolant temperature. Think of it like a sort of a closed loop style temperature target. Same sort of thing with the fans. Now that we've got that water circulating with electric water pump, if the thing does start to get too hot, it's got 2 fans on the back. They're also staged through the engine management system so that once we get to 88 degrees, we'll have 1 fan turn on. Once we get to 92 degrees Celsius, the second fan will turn on. That staging those is really nice because if they both come on at the same time, they pull a heap of current instantly, and you can hear the engine note change when the alternator loads up. Whereas staging them one at a time makes it a whole lot smoother and nicer to tune. If it was a street car, that would be absolutely essential. Being a race car, it's less important, but you still want the niceties, you know? If the outputs are there to do it, why not? In order to get all that power to the ground, the factory Nissan R200 style diff just wasn't going to cut it. So this thing has a Sicky's Winters 10-inch diff in a custom housing under here. And what's really nice about that is it allows you to quick change the back of the diff so you can have a whole bunch of different ratios depending on the track that you're at. It's got a little diff breather up here for that quick change diff. It's nice and simple. Over the side here, just like you'd have in the front, you've got an expansion tank for the cooling system. And one of the things that I really like about this car that shows the thought that's put into it and for servicing it at the track, being a drift car, they absolutely rip tyres off this thing. So every time it goes out, it'll do a set of rear tyres. Being able to change those tyres is pretty important. So they've obviously got their rattle guns and all of that stuff. But if you look down the bottom here, it's got a pickup point on that rear bar so that you just bring your trolley jack in, jack it up at that central point, whip the wheels off, slap them back on, and away you go again. So something as simple as that makes it so much easier for the guys in the pits to swap the tyres and get the car ready for the next round. First thing first, Matty Hill, thanks mate. This is a cockpit that I actually fit in and I feel comfortable in. So for us tall guys, mate, plenty of space in here to drive this thing, and that is awesome. Engine management wise, this thing's completely controlled by a Haltech Nexus R5. The R5 is doing the starter motor control, the water pumps, the fuel pumps, direct fire for the 6 coils, the 6 sequential injectors, the entire engine, the keypad here, water methanol setup, the wipers, the indicators, the hazards, you name it, the data logging. It's got 512 meg of onboard data logging that's controlled either it automatically turns on as the engine RPM comes up, or Matty's got a button down here that we can press that automatically turns the data logging on in case there's something particularly he wants to capture. Up the front here for the display, Matty's got the IC7 dash, so that's displaying our coolant temp, our boost pressure, our air-fuel ratio using Haltech's LSU 4.9 oxygen sensor. We've got fuel pressure, oil temperature, air temperature, battery voltage, RPM and gear, obviously. Gear's probably an important one to have in this car because it does have a Jericho 4-speed NASCAR style dog box. So a little bit different. The 4-speed box in this would be absolutely unbreakable, so I understand why they've chosen that box. It'll display what gear you're in up on the dash here. Hopefully he'll be into 4th gear and sliding it as sideways as possible while pulling the hydraulic handbrake here as well. Interesting positioning in a drift car. So compared to a circuit car that obviously don't really use a handbrake, in something like this, once we get into the target gear, then we've got the e-brake. So the hydraulic handbrake here that locks up the rear wheels in order to get us at the right angle in order to get into that corner and get that corner speed. One of the beautiful things about using the Nexus R5 in conjunction with the dash and now the keypad stuff is the lack of wiring. There's a tiny bit of a CAN communication. So there's 4 wires that go from the ECU to the dash, from the dash to the keypad. Then all of those inputs and all of that information is shared between all of those devices. The keypad here has got the start-stop button, so that makes the starter motor turn on and turn off. We can do things in the ECU that are really cool. So if the thing's not in neutral, for example, or if you're not on the brake, or if you don't have the clutch engaged, it won't turn the starter motor on until you've met those enabling conditions so that you can't hit the starter accidentally and the thing rolls forward. We've got stuff on the keypads like the power steering pump, a thermofan override, a water meth injection enable. We've got the oil cooler fan so that we can hit that. That'll turn the fan on for the intercooler and override the automatic control. If he's come back into the pits, he might want to sit and have the engine off, but be able to go through and override all of those fans in order to cool the thing as quickly as possible. By default, all of those fans are normally going to turn off when we turn the engine off, and that's to conserve battery power so that you can start it the next time. However, there are plenty of conditions where that's not always the case. You might want to come in and turn on the oil fan at the front, and you might want to turn on the water pump and turn on the thermofans at the back to cool the engine right down before the next round. We've got a wiper button here, so when we hit that, we've got the windscreen wipers. We can have high speed, low speed. They'll park automatically back at the right position. We've got our high beams, we've got our hazards, and we've got our indicators. Not so important in a drift car, but some tracks do require us to have hazards and turn signals. If a scrutineer does pick you up on something like that, that could ruin your weekend. So you might want to check on stuff like that. Make sure you can do your hazards through your power distribution module or your engine management system. Now that these cars are competing at such a high level and have such huge entry speeds, it's really important to have that safety. This thing's got a beautiful cage. It's got huge side intrusion bars so that if it is absolutely sideways and someone that you're battling against comes straight into your door, you know you're going to be pretty safe in here. For driver and sometimes passenger comfort, it's got these really nice Velo seats that are super, super comfortable. It's got the Sabelt 5-point harnesses. It's got just the standard drift wheel, the Nardi steering wheel, which I really like. And one thing that makes you feel really comfortable in here, it's got a factory Nissan S15 dash. So when you're sitting here, you can kind of get a feel for what this car was when it came out standard. One of the interesting little features in here, I don't know who's made these, but we'll have to suss that out. Where the aircon vents normally were, it's got these cute little sort of throttle body looking things to open or close there. There's not much air conditioning going on, and I'm sure it gets bloody hot in here, but they're a nice little piece that make it just a little bit different. Within drifting, competitors are judged on a whole bunch of different things, and one of the things that they're judged on is if they're hitting the brakes applied to the front wheels in order to slow the car down. Not the rear in order to kick it out, that's pretty normal, but if the driver's pressing the front brake in order to set the car up at the right speed, normally points are deducted. And the way that they figure that out, pretty simple. If I press the brakes here, they've got lights all over the roof so that the judges know exactly when the driver is pressing that brake pedal. And that, my friends, is the anatomy of a drift car. Something that was born in the hills of Japan as something that people would take relatively standard cars and slide them as sideways as possible. That's turned into something of an absolutely professional sport where these cars are true top-level competitors, and something that I'm more and more excited about seeing more competitors in Australia. I know in the US, we've already got a huge amount of drifters. In Australia, I'm looking forward to seeing more and more competition so more of these cars get built. As always, thanks so much for watching. I've enjoyed going through this car. Maybe you can let me know what the next style of competitive car you want me to check out, and I'll do my best to get my hands on one. As always, thanks very much for watching till the end. My name's Scott. Catch you next time.
Thanks for watching, guys. If you like this video, smash that like button. We put out a new video every week and sometimes even two. So don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more awesome content.